Tonight we're stepping back in time to the wild, icy north. Imagine you're living in the Viking Age, surrounded by howling winds and snow that stretches as far as the eye can see. It's not a pretty sight, and no, you probably won't survive this without a bit of grit. The days are short and the nights are long, endless in fact. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and refuses to let go. If you think you're tough enough to face it, remember, these Vikings had to endure this every winter. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment with where you're tuning in from and what time it is there. I love knowing where everyone is from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As the last leaf falls from the trees, the Viking world is hit by an unrelenting chill. The long, dark winter has come, and it isn't just a season, it's a battle for survival. The world you knew during the warm, sun-filled months of summer seems to slip away as the ground hardens, rivers freeze, and daylight becomes a rare commodity. But there's no time for complaining. Vikings know that life must go on. You gather what you can before the first snow falls, preparing for the long wait ahead. As a Viking, your survival depends on your resourcefulness. This isn't just about staying warm. It's about keeping your family alive through the darkest and coldest days. The horizon of white is an invitation to challenge the elements and adapt, but not without difficulty. For every Viking, the coming winter means living through months of food shortages, freezing temperatures, and isolation. It's a different world now, but think about it for a second. How would you survive with nothing more than the harsh landscape, limited supplies, and sheer willpower to get you through? You've probably never experienced cold like this. The Viking people, though, had honed the art of survival in ways we can't even imagine today. Awaiting continue. As the cold sets in, you realize that surviving the winter isn't just about keeping yourself warm. The Viking way of life was rooted in preparation, and that preparation starts with shelter. The homes you live in are the first line of defense against the brutal conditions outside. If you've ever felt the sting of a draft or a sudden drop in temperature, you can imagine what it's like to spend months in a home that has to fight against freezing winds and heavy snowstorms. Viking houses, known as longhouses, were built to endure the harshest winters. They were more than just shelter. They were fortresses of warmth. Constructed from wood, turf, and stone, these homes were designed with thick walls to trap heat and keep the cold out. The roof was usually steeply pitched to help the snow slide off, preventing the weight from collapsing the structure. Inside, the longhouse was often one large, open space, with a central hearth where the fire burned continuously, day and night. That fire wasn't just for warmth. It was the heart of the home, providing light, cooking heat, and a sense of safety. The hearth was often positioned in the center of the room, surrounded by a family of Vikings huddled together, using the warmth to fend off the biting cold. You can imagine that everyone, your family, livestock, tools, even food, was kept within close proximity to that fire. The longhouse wasn't just a living space, it was a communal hub, and it served multiple purposes. But here's the kicker. The longhouse wasn't exactly a model of insulation like our modern homes. In fact, these houses were drafty, especially when the wind howled through the cracks. So the Vikings had to work with what they had, sealing off windows and doorways with animal skins or other materials, and constantly tending to the fire. Even with all this effort, the temperature inside wasn't exactly cozy. It was just less hostile than the freezing cold outside. Historians still debate whether Vikings might have used additional heat sources like stone or clay to radiate warmth through the home. Some evidence suggests that they had heated floors in some homes, while others think they relied more heavily on the constant maintenance of the fire to survive. Either way, the importance of a safe, warm space during these long winters cannot be overstated. The longhouse was the center of Viking life, where survival began, and where the fight against the winter cold was fought and won, one log at a time. Now you might be thinking, okay, I've got my warm longhouse. What else do I need? Well, if you've ever tried to warm up by the fire, you know that it's not enough to just sit there and hope for the best. You need layers, warmth from all angles. Enter the sacred fires of Viking life, where fire wasn't just a convenience, it was life itself. The fire was the central force keeping the longhouse habitable, providing both warmth and light to get through those long, most dark nights. But the significance of fire went beyond practicality. It was deeply woven into Viking beliefs and rituals. The hearth fire in Viking homes wasn't simply a way to cook food and heat the house. It was seen as a symbolic, sacred presence. In Norse mythology, the hearth was sacred to the goddess Hestia, who shares her name with a similar figure in Greek mythology, who was associated with home and hearth. The fire was regarded as a source of protection, safety, and even divinity. You can imagine that a Viking would never let the fire go out. It was both a practical and spiritual necessity. It's not just about burning wood to keep warm. The way Vikings kept their fire alive was a skill. The fire had to burn continuously, no easy task during freezing temperatures. Vikings were careful with their firewood, knowing that some wood burned hotter and longer than others. Certain types of wood, like oak, would be stored for the long nights. Wood needed to be dry to burn efficiently, so the Vikings would store their logs in places sheltered from the snow and rain, ensuring a steady supply of dry fuel for the hearth. If the fire did go out, it could spell disaster. It wasn't just about being cold, it could mean the end of food, light, and warmth. Some scholars argue that Vikings might have used specialized tools for maintaining fire. Firestones, for example, are believed to have been used to help start and maintain flames in difficult conditions. A spark from these could light a fire even in wet conditions, a crucial tool in the Viking toolkit. However, fire wasn't just a practical necessity. Vikings were deeply superstitious, and many believed that their hearth fires held spiritual significance. For example, the fire itself might be seen as a manifestation of the divine. It was common for Vikings to perform offerings or rituals around the hearth, using the fire to communicate with the gods or ancestors. The smoke from the fire, rising into the air, was thought to carry messages to the heavens. If the fire burned brightly and consistently, it was a sign that the gods were watching over the family. But if the flames dimmed, it was seen as a bad omen, a signal that something might be wrong. Of course, fire had its dangers too. The Vikings had to balance the warmth and comfort it provided with the ever-present risk of burning down their homes. Imagine being surrounded by dried wood, fur, and cloth. The entire structure was basically one big tinderbox. Keeping the fire safe was a constant concern. But as long as the hearth burned bright, the Viking home was safe, and winter could be faced with a little more confidence. Howls outside and snow piles up against your door, you realize that a warm house and a steady fire aren't enough to protect you from the full force of the Viking winter. When you step out to gather more firewood or check on the livestock, you'll soon notice something crucial: your clothing. Without the right layers, no fire or shelter will keep you from freezing to the core. The Viking wardrobe was built for just this, a perfect balance of practicality and protection against the relentless cold. Vikings were masters of layering. The base layer, closest to the skin, was usually made of wool or linen. Wool, as you can probably imagine, was incredibly valuable for Vikings. Unlike modern fabrics, wool was excellent at trapping heat, even when it was wet. The Vikings would wear long tunics or shirts made of wool, which could be adjusted depending on the weather conditions. And it wasn't just about warmth. The wool was also durable, tough enough to survive the harsh conditions of Viking life. Over this base layer, Vikings would wear outer garments, often made from animal skins or furs. Think of a thick cloak, possibly made from bear, reindeer, or wolf pelts. These garments didn't just keep the cold out. They also helped the Vikings blend to their environment. Furs and hides provided camouflage against the white snow, making it easier to sneak up on prey or enemies. For the legs, Vikings wore trousers or leggings made of wool, leather, or fur. These garments would have been close-fitting to allow for ease of movement, but also layered for warmth. The practicality of Viking clothing cannot be overstated. Each piece had a purpose, and there was no room for excess. It was about survival, and that meant every item was multifunctional. When you step outside, you're also going to notice the cold hitting your face and hands. In response, the Vikings made sure to protect every inch of exposed skin. Fur-lined hoods and mittens would be essential for shielding your face from frostbite. Some Viking warriors even wore metal face protection, like a spangenhelm, a type of helmet with a nose guard to protect their faces during long winters or in battle. Here's something a bit odd. Historians debate whether the Vikings ever used wool-lined shoes in winter. Some believe that they simply used leather boots, while others think that wool might have been used to line boots to help keep feet warm. Either way, one thing is clear. The Vikings had a deeply practical understanding of cold weather gear. While it might not have been the most fashionable attire by today's standards, it was designed with one thing in mind: survival. One quirky tidbit: it's been suggested that Vikings might have used animal intestines for making shoes and gloves. Some of the materials found in archaeological digs point to the use of animal gut in Viking garments, which would have added an extra layer of protection from the cold, as the material is surprisingly tough and weather-resistant. Historians still argue whether these gut garments were purely functional or had some ritual significance, but the fact remains that nothing went to waste in Viking culture. Everything had a purpose. The Viking approach to clothing wasn't just about warmth, it was about preparing for the elements. Whether you're preparing for a long journey or heading into battle, the layers of your Viking clothing form an integral part of your survival. With the bitter winds cutting through your clothing and the snow piling up outside, you know that you'll need more than just layers to survive the Viking winter. If you're going to make it through, you'll need to rely on your skills to gather food. And when it comes to hunting in the snow, the Vikings were masters of the craft. With limited resources and a landscape that could shift from harsh to brutal in an instant, the art of hunting was a crucial skill in the winter months. Hunting in the winter wasn't easy. The thick snow and icy temperatures made tracking and catching prey far more challenging than it would have been in the warmer months. But Vikings were prepared. They used the conditions to their advantage, making clever use of the landscape to hunt everything from reindeer and elk to smaller animals like hares and foxes. The snow, while a challenge for human hunters, was a gift for skilled trackers. The soft footprints of an animal were easier to follow in the snow than on soft ground, and the Vikings had developed expert knowledge of the terrain and the animals they hunted. The Viking way of hunting was not just about grabbing a bow and shooting an animal. It was a deeply strategic practice. Hunters often worked in groups, using coordinated tactics to corner their prey. One of the most important techniques involved setting traps, simple yet effective. They would craft snares and pits designed to capture or immobilize animals, ensuring that food was available even when the hunters themselves couldn't actively pursue it. The Vikings also knew when to lay low, waiting out the storm for the right moment to strike. One method that might surprise you is the use of dogs in hunting. The Vikings were known to use sled dogs, not just for pulling carts, but also for hunting. These dogs would help track and even catch prey in the snow, adding another layer of efficiency to the Viking hunt. There's evidence to suggest that they used a breed similar to the modern-day husky, bred for its stamina and resilience in harsh, cold environments. Dogs were invaluable partners in the harsh winters, and their role in hunting was crucial for maintaining a steady food supply. And what about the more dangerous hunts? Well, the Vikings were skilled in hunting larger animals too, such as the mighty bear. Bear hunting was a tradition deeply rooted in Norse culture and mythology, and it was a mark of a warrior's bravery. While bear hunting wasn't something you'd do on a whim, it became a ritual for certain Viking groups. It was thought to imbue the hunter with the spirit of the bear, strengthening them for battle. Historians still argue whether such hunts were more ceremonial than practical, but one thing's for sure: they were a key part of Viking survival. If hunting wasn't fruitful, Vikings would also turn to scavenging, looking for wild berries or nuts buried deep in the snow, and even seeking out mushrooms or edible roots. But these were the exception, not the rule. The vast majority of Viking diets came from meat, deer, wild boar, and whatever else the land could offer up, especially during the long winter months. You probably won't be hunting in the snow anytime soon, but imagine being a Viking trying to track a wild animal through the snow while the temperature hovers well below freezing. Hunting in such an environment would test your endurance, your skill, and your patience. Yet, it was through this relentless pursuit of food that the Vikings were able to survive those endless months of snow and ice. Probably starting to get the idea by now. Surviving the Viking winter wasn't about just one thing. It was a system of strategies, each one dependent on the others to get through those harsh, unforgiving months. And if hunting didn't always pan out, well, then there was another crucial skill you'd need: fishing. But not just any fishing. Vikings were ice fishermen. It might sound a little strange, but ice fishing was a vital practice in Viking culture, particularly for those living in the colder, more isolated parts of Scandinavia. During the deep freeze of winter, many rivers, lakes, and even parts of the sea would freeze solid, trapping fish beneath layers of ice. But for the Vikings, this was no reason to give up on fish. Quite the opposite. They saw the frozen waterways as an opportunity to catch what would otherwise be hard to reach. You might wonder, how do you fish when the water's frozen solid? Well, it's all about breaking through that thick ice to create a hole where fish could be caught. Viking fishermen would use axes and saws to chop through the ice, sometimes making large circular openings big enough to cast nets or set traps through. The ingenuity of these ice fishermen was unmatched. They'd drop hooks, baited with carefully chosen lures, into the icy waters, waiting for a bite. The Vikings knew the seasonal movements of fish, and while some fish species would go deeper into the water or hibernate, others would stay near the surface, perfect for ice fishing. Ice fishing wasn't just about survival, it was a crucial part of their diet. Fresh fish was a welcome source of protein during the winter months when other food might be scarce. Even dried fish, stored away from the previous harvests, could be soaked and cooked when fresh food ran low. But one of the biggest advantages of ice fishing was that it could be done throughout the winter, allowing Vikings to continually harvest from the water even when the land was buried in snow. For Viking families living near lakes or coastal regions, this was a lifeline, another way to make sure they were never too far from a meal. Fishing also had its cultural importance. The Vikings were very much tied to the sea, and they saw the water as both a source of sustenance and a domain of their gods. Norse mythology is rich with tales of gods and creatures of the water, from the giant Midgard serpent that encircles the earth to the goddess Ran, who presides over drowned souls. For the Vikings, fishing wasn't just a livelihood, it was a connection to the divine. But there's something a little odd to consider when we talk about Viking fishing: how much they were willing to risk. Think about it. Venturing out onto frozen lakes or rivers during the coldest months, hoping the ice would hold and that you wouldn't fall through into freezing waters. It sounds dangerous, right? It was. Ice fishing required a level of bravery and skill that was deeply woven into the Viking character. After all, it was a question of life and death. Fall into that icy water and the cold would kill you in minutes. And yet, the Vikings faced this risk daily, using their resourcefulness to ensure they had enough food to see them through until spring. Historians still debate how common ice fishing was across Viking territories. In some areas, it was a well-established practice, especially in inland regions. In coastal areas, they might rely more on hunting seals or fishing through holes in thinner ice sheets. But no matter where you lived, the art of fishing, whether in open water or through the ice, was a key to survival. Sources like hunting and ice fishing keeping the Vikings fed through the dark winter months, the next essential piece of the survival puzzle is how to store all that food. Because let's face it, you can't be out there hunting or fishing every single day. Some days the weather will make it impossible to get out of the house, and on others, you simply won't have the time. So what did the Vikings do? They preserved their food in ingenious ways to ensure that they had enough to make it through those endless winter nights. Food preservation was an art in Viking society. It wasn't like today, where refrigeration is just a matter of plugging in a machine. Instead, Vikings relied on natural processes like drying, smoking, salting, and fermenting to keep their food fresh for months at a time. Let's start with drying. Meat and fish were often dried to prevent spoilage, and they used the dry, cold air of winter to help with this process. Large fish like cod would be hung up to dry in the open air, while smaller cuts of meat would be preserved in similar ways. The drying process was so effective that Vikings would sometimes store these dried goods for an entire year. Then there was smoking, another technique to keep food from spoiling. Smoking not only preserved the meat, but also gave it a rich flavor that added to its desirability. Vikings would smoke meat and fish over fires that burned for hours, using oak or juniper wood to impart unique flavors into the food. It was the perfect way to prepare for winter, ensuring that the Vikings would have a steady supply of protein even when hunting was difficult. Salt was another key element in the preservation process. Vikings living in coastal areas had an advantage here, as they could harvest salt from the sea. Salted fish, especially, was a staple in the Viking diet. They'd pack fish like herring or cod in barrels and cover them in salt, which drew out moisture and kept bacteria from growing. This method of preservation meant that fish could last months, even through the harshest of winters. Fermentation, too, played a huge role in Viking survival. You probably won't be surprised to learn that Vikings were fond of fermented foods. They used fermentation for everything from vegetables to dairy products. Think of sourdough bread, fermented cabbage, and even fermented fish. It wasn't just about adding flavor, it was also about keeping their food safe to eat for longer. Fermented foods also provided an important source of probiotics, which helped keep the Vikings' digestive systems healthy during the long months of limited fresh food. Historians still argue over the extent of fermentation practices in Viking culture. While some suggest that fermented foods were considered more of a necessity than a luxury, others believe they might have been part of a broader culinary tradition, one that was also tied to rituals and social gatherings. In any case, the practice was essential to their survival, as it ensured that they could still eat nutritious, tasty food during the months when fresh options were scarce. You might also be surprised to learn that Vikings used root cellars to store some of their food, such as vegetables and root crops. These cellars, dug deep into the earth to take advantage of the constant cool temperatures below the ground, kept vegetables fresh for much longer than if they'd been left in the open air. These root cellars were a key element of Viking food storage, and without them, the long winter months would have been much harder to get through. All these preservation methods were not only practical, they were an expression of Viking ingenuity and adaptability. They didn't just rely on what they could catch in the moment. They planned ahead, knowing that winter would come and they would need to be prepared. Their ability to preserve food was one of the main reasons they were able to survive the dark, cold months when food was most scarce. While hunting, fishing, and food preservation were crucial to surviving the winter, there was another important element to Viking nutrition that shouldn't be overlooked: fermented foods. You may not immediately think of fermented foods as a survival tool, but in Viking society, they were just as essential as meat, fish, and grains. Fermentation played a key role not only in preserving food, but in boosting the Vikings' overall health and resilience during the long, dark months. Fermented foods were vital in extending the life of perishable goods, especially during winter. In the absence of modern refrigeration, fermentation allowed Vikings to preserve a wide range of food, from vegetables to fish, dairy, and even beverages. The process of fermentation helped prevent spoilage, turning foods into something much more than their original form. It created sour, tangy flavors, provided vital nutrients, and preserved foods for months on end, even during the coldest periods of the year. One of the most common fermented foods was surströmming, a kind of fermented herring, which Vikings relied on for sustenance. Fermented fish in general was a staple of the Viking diet. Fish could be caught in the late summer and then left to ferment and cure throughout the winter, preserving it for months. In some cases, they would bury the fish underground, letting it ferment slowly. The process was an effective way to ensure that they always had protein on hand, even when fresh fish was not available due to freezing waters. Another fermented food commonly eaten by Vikings was kefir, a fermented milk product similar to yogurt. Vikings, being herders, often had access to dairy products, and they took full advantage of this by fermenting milk to create kefir, which was both nutritious and long-lasting. Kefir was rich in probiotics, which helped to maintain digestive health, a crucial benefit during the winter months when fresh vegetables and fruits were scarce. Kefir and other dairy-based fermented foods were also a source of vitamins and minerals that helped support the Vikings' overall health through the long, cold months. Fermented vegetables, such as pickled cabbage and root vegetables, were also common in Viking households. These pickled foods, much like the fish, could be stored for long periods without spoiling. The process of fermentation also made certain vegetables more digestible, allowing the Vikings to get more nutrients from their food. Foods like sauerkraut and pickled beets might seem like modern delicacies today, but to the Vikings, they were vital sources of vitamins and minerals. Historians still debate how widespread the practice of fermenting foods was among the Vikings. While some believe it was a regional practice, especially common in coastal areas where fish was abundant, others argue that fermentation was used more widely as a way to ensure food availability throughout the entire year. Whatever the case, it's clear that fermentation was a technique that allowed the Vikings to stretch their food supplies and keep their diet diverse, even during the darkest months of winter. Fermented beverages also played a role in Viking life. While not quite as common as food fermentation, there is evidence to suggest that Vikings fermented grains to make mead, a fermented honey drink. Mead was often consumed during social gatherings, festivals, or religious ceremonies. It was considered a drink of the gods, and there was even a connection between mead and the idea of immortality in Viking lore. Some historians believe that the Vikings may have brewed mead in large quantities during the winter months, keeping it stored for months on end. As the Vikings carefully fermented their food and drink, they were essentially taking part in a process that had been used for millennia by various cultures around the world. Fermentation was not only an art, but a necessary part of survival. The Viking winters were long, and without the preservation techniques that included fermentation, life during the winter months would have been much more difficult. But there was more to fermentation than just necessity. There was also a cultural aspect to it. Fermented foods were deeply embedded in Viking traditions and rituals. The Vikings believed in the spiritual power of food, and certain fermented foods were seen as more than just nourishment. They were thought to hold protective properties and to be a means of connecting with the gods. These foods, in their fermented forms, were both practical and spiritual tools for survival. As you look around your Viking home, it's hard not to notice the presence of livestock. If you've been paying attention, you might have already realized just how vital animals were to the Viking way of life, especially during those brutal winter months. Vikings didn't just hunt wild game, they kept livestock too. Livestock was not only a source of meat and milk, but also of wool, hides, and even companionship. In a world where the cold could kill, animals were an essential part of surviving the harsh winters. Cattle, sheep, and goats were the most common livestock kept by Vikings. These animals provided milk, which was a vital part of the Viking diet. Milk could be consumed fresh, but more often than not, it was turned into other products like cheese or butter, both of which were much more durable and could last for months. Think about it. You're stuck inside for days at a time during a snowstorm. Fresh food is running low, but thanks to your cows and goats, you've got a steady supply of dairy. You might even have cheese stored away that you made during the warmer months. Sheep were especially important because they gave more than just milk. Sheep provided wool, which could be spun into yarn to create the clothing and blankets that kept you warm. During the winter, you relied heavily on wool to make garments that would stand up to the freezing temperatures. Wool is an incredible material because it retains heat even when it's wet, which was particularly important for the Vikings, who were often caught out in the snow and rain. Goats, too, were invaluable. Their milk could be used to make cheese, and their hides were used to make clothing or tents. Their wool, from certain breeds, was used for spinning into yarn and fabric. And let's not forget the smaller animals like chickens and pigs, which provided eggs, meat, and other products that were essential for maintaining the Viking diet throughout the winter months. Even horses had a role to play, although more indirectly. Horses were valuable for travel and trade, but they also provided leather for goods like shoes, saddles, and clothing. You might even use horsehair to make ropes or other useful materials. Horses, though primarily valued for transportation, contributed in several ways to the Viking lifestyle, especially when it came to surviving in the winter. The Vikings understood the delicate balance of having animals close to home. They kept their livestock in warm, sheltered spaces within or near the longhouse, where they could stay protected from the bitter cold. The Vikings also made sure to store enough fodder for the animals to eat throughout the winter. You couldn't just leave your cattle and sheep to forage in the snow. They needed hay or grain to survive. Keeping your animals well fed during the cold months was as important as keeping your family nourished. But livestock wasn't just about food, it was also a form of wealth. The Vikings were known for their raids, and during these raids, they would often capture livestock from the places they attacked. This allowed them to increase their wealth and also ensured they had enough animals to trade. The value of animals, especially in Viking society, was immense. A healthy cow or a flock of sheep could be the difference between survival and starvation. In fact, historians believe that the Vikings used livestock as a form of currency, often exchanging animals for goods or services. Historians still debate the full extent to which the Vikings relied on their animals during the winter. Some argue that livestock was crucial to their survival, while others suggest that it might have been more of a luxury for wealthier families who had the resources to maintain large herds. However, one thing is certain: livestock played a major role in Viking survival, both for food and other essential resources like wool, leather, and milk. To think that in these seemingly desolate winter months, animals were keeping Viking society going, providing everything from protein to warmth. You've got your woolen garments, your milk, your cheese, and even your leather. Without livestock, surviving those long winters would have been near impossible. Livestock played a significant role in the Viking winter survival plan. The women of Viking society were equally essential in ensuring that the family not only survived but thrived during the harshest months of the year. You might not immediately think of Viking women as the frontline warriors, but when it came to enduring the brutal winters, they were often the backbone of daily life. Viking women were central figures in managing the household, ensuring that the community stayed fed, warm, and organized, especially when the men were off raiding or preparing for battle. The responsibilities of a Viking woman during the winter months were multifaceted and demanding. At the heart of the Viking home was the woman, often referred to as the husfru, or housewife, a title that carries far more weight than it might sound. The husfru didn't just manage the household. She was the primary caretaker of the family's well-being, tasked with overseeing the preparation of food, the preservation of resources, and the maintenance of the home. While the men might have been outside hunting, battling, or trading, the women were the ones ensuring that the home remained functional through the long, dark winter. One of the most crucial roles that Viking women played was in the food production and preservation process. While men hunted and fished, women were the ones who took the fruits of these labors and turned them into food that could be eaten, stored, and prepared for later. This meant that women spent significant amounts of time smoking, salting, and drying meat and fish, as well as baking bread, making cheese, and preserving fruits and vegetables. In short, women were the guardians of the winter stores. Without them, the food prepared in the fall wouldn't have lasted long enough to make it through the entire winter. Moreover, women were responsible for creating and maintaining the clothing that would keep their families warm. If you've ever sewn or knitted, you can imagine how labor-intensive it would be to create woolen garments, mittens, socks, and blankets for an entire family. Viking women were skilled in weaving, spinning wool, and making clothing out of the various materials available to them. Wool was prized for its insulating properties, and women spent long hours ensuring that every family member had the necessary layers to endure the freezing cold. Historians still argue over the exact roles Viking women played in relation to men during the winter months, with some suggesting that women had a more active role in Viking society than we often give them credit for. While many Viking sagas focus on male warriors and their daring exploits, The women were the quiet, essential foundation that kept the Viking community intact during the harshest seasons. They were the ones ensuring that the men's victories in battle and the resources brought back from raids would actually be put to use. If men went off to war, it was the women who stayed behind, managing the home and making sure it remained functional. It wasn't just about practical survival skills either. Viking women were also spiritual leaders of the home. Norse beliefs held that women had a connection to the spiritual world, and they were often the ones who conducted rituals to honor the gods and ancestors. These rituals were integral to the Viking understanding of the world, and they were especially important during the winter months. Many Viking women likely performed ceremonies to ensure that the gods would look favorably on the family, providing protection from illness, cold, and hunger. It wasn't just about surviving the winter, it was about ensuring the gods' favor for the coming year. While you're huddled up inside, protected from the cold, don't forget that the Viking women were probably the first to wake each day and the last to sleep, working tirelessly to keep everything running smoothly. Their work was quiet and steady, but without it, the entire Viking way of life would have crumbled. Viking survival during the winter wasn't just a matter of battle prowess or external resources. It was deeply dependent on the strength, skill, and determination of the women who kept the home fires burning. By now, it's clear that the Vikings knew how to survive, even thrive, through those seemingly endless winters. But let's step back for a moment and think about something that might seem a bit odd, given the conditions: the Viking longship. You might be wondering how these seafaring warriors, renowned for their naval prowess, survived in the winter, especially when most of the waters they relied on froze over. If the Viking Age was marked by their impressive ability to navigate the seas, then how did they manage during the coldest, most inhospitable months of the year? Surprisingly, Viking longships were designed to withstand more than just high seas. They were built to adapt, even in the face of freezing waters. In fact, Viking ships were incredibly versatile. While you might think that the longships were primarily used for raiding and trading during the warmer months, these ships were also used to navigate frozen rivers and coastal areas. The longships' shallow drafts allowed them to travel through both deep waters and shallower streams, making them perfect for navigating even during the colder months when other vessels might have been stuck in the ice. Now, you might imagine that the freezing temperatures would have put a serious damper on Viking seafaring activities. While it's true that many Viking longships were grounded during the worst of winter, they still had a vital role to play. During the months when the water was impassable, Vikings relied on their ships as a base for winter activities. They would often pull the ships ashore, either storing them in sheltered coves or hiding them in the forest. These ships weren't just for sea voyages. They were storage and staging areas used to keep essential supplies close at hand. But how did the Vikings manage to keep the ships safe from winter's chill? The Viking longships were constructed with resilience in mind. The frames were typically made from oak, a strong wood that could withstand exposure to the elements. Additionally, the ships were built with overlapping planks, making them incredibly strong and flexible. These ships were designed to handle the pounding of ocean waves, but that same flexibility allowed them to adapt to changes in the environment, like moving over frozen waters. Historians still argue whether Vikings were actively sailing or raiding during the winter months, or if the cold weather forced them to pause their voyages entirely. Some believe that while the Vikings may have stopped longer expeditions in the winter, they would still embark on shorter trips, such as trading or raiding nearby coastal villages. While much of the focus on Viking naval activities is about the summer months and their infamous raids, there is evidence suggesting that the Viking longships were still very much a part of the winter landscape. One of the more fascinating elements of Viking longship use was their adaptability. The longships weren't just seafaring vessels, they were a symbol of the Viking way of life, and their design allowed them to navigate rivers, fjords, and even ice. The Vikings had a unique understanding of their environment and knew how to make the most of their ships, no matter the season. In fact, the longships may have been more integral to winter survival than we give them credit for. In the dead of winter, with the rivers frozen solid and the coastlines covered in snow, the Vikings would pull their ships onto land and use them as mobile homes. The ships could also serve as storage spaces for food, weapons, and other essentials, which was particularly important when venturing through difficult terrain or when enemies were lurking nearby. The Viking ship wasn't just a vessel, it was a vital piece of their winter survival toolkit. Despite the ice and snow, the Vikings' relationship with their ships never stopped. The adaptability of the longship, whether on the open sea or on frozen ground, reflects the Vikings' resilience and resourcefulness. It wasn't just about surviving winter, it was about finding ways to make even the harshest months work in their favor. Seeing how the Vikings adapted their lifestyle for winter, whether it's through crafting warm clothing, preserving food, or even making sure their longships were ready for any challenge. But the Viking warrior didn't spend all his time fighting battles and hunting game. He too had to adapt to the long, harsh winters. Training, staying fit, and maintaining combat readiness was just as crucial for survival as any other skill. The Vikings didn't just huddle up by the fire, waiting for spring to come. They used the harsh winter months to prepare themselves for the coming battles, ensuring that their bodies stayed in prime condition even when the cold tried to keep them indoors. Winter training was vital for maintaining strength, endurance, and skill. You see, unlike today's world, where most of us can pop into a gym for a quick workout, Vikings had to rely on the environment around them to keep in fighting shape. Without access to fancy equipment or warm weather for outdoor training, Vikings improvised. Heavy lifting was done with logs, stones, and other objects that could be found in nature. The cold didn't stop them from practicing with weapons either. Swords, axes, and shields were all honed in the harsh conditions. Every Viking knew that staying sharp in combat meant enduring the same trials that would face their enemies. Historians still debate the exact methods of Viking warrior training during the winter months. Some suggest that they focused on honing their physical endurance by running and swimming in icy waters, toughening their bodies for combat. Others argue that Vikings spent more time perfecting the art of close-quarter combat, where strength and skill with an axe or sword could mean the difference between life and death. One thing is certain, winter was a time when the Viking warrior didn't rest. He trained through the snow, enduring the cold, so that when the thaw came, he was ready for battle. But the mental aspect of Viking training shouldn't be underestimated either. Winter survival wasn't just about staying fit or keeping warm, it was also about maintaining mental toughness. The Viking warriors had a code of honor, a sense of resilience that was cultivated in the long, lonely winter months. It's said that they would often practice mental exercises, preparing themselves for the brutality of battle and the challenges of life. These mental drills may have included things like endurance tests, focused combat practice, and meditation. Whatever the form, these practices made them stronger and better prepared for the coming season of raids and battles. What's also interesting to consider is how winter itself may have impacted Viking warfare. While Vikings were often seen as fierce warriors, it's likely that the cold weather influenced how they approached conflict. It wasn't just about swords and shields, it was about using the environment to your advantage. With frozen waters and snow-covered landscapes, Vikings could approach battles from unexpected angles, using the harsh winter terrain as a tool rather than a hindrance. This made Viking warriors highly adaptable, able to face off against enemies in any conditions, no matter how tough or cold the environment might be. Vikings didn't just train for war. They also stayed in peak physical condition to defend their homes and families during the harsh winter months. Their readiness wasn't just for raids, it was about keeping their communities safe in an unpredictable and dangerous world. Imagine the fortitude it took to be ready for battle despite the cold, and to survive long winters with limited food, harsh conditions, and the constant threat of enemy raids. The mental toughness and physical endurance developed during winter training made Viking warriors some of the most feared fighters in history. And even though the cold was relentless, the discipline they maintained throughout the winter months gave them an edge when spring arrived, ready to strike and conquer. As the Viking warriors honed their strength and skills, There was another crucial aspect of survival during the cold months that needs to be addressed: the Vikings' beliefs. Their connection to the supernatural and their reliance on ritual and magic during winter played a vital role in how they endured the harshest seasons. For the Vikings, the winter months were not just a time of physical survival. They were also a time when the boundaries between the living and the spiritual world seemed to blur. The long, dark nights were when they called upon their gods and spirits to ensure their protection and success in the months to come. The Vikings' relationship with winter was deeply influenced by their religious beliefs. Norse mythology, rich with gods and spirits, gave the Vikings a framework for understanding and enduring the harsh conditions. For them, winter wasn't just about the physical challenges. It was a battle of wills, a struggle between light and dark, and between the living and the dead. It was during the cold months that the Vikings would often perform rituals to ask for divine favor and protection from the elements. At the heart of these spiritual practices was the worship of gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya, who were believed to have power over the natural world and the forces that governed life and death. It wasn't uncommon for Vikings to perform sacrifices, both to please the gods and to secure their protection against winter's dangers. Offerings might include food, weapons, and sometimes even animals, especially during important festivals or celebrations like Blots, the sacrificial feasts held to honor the gods. During winter, these rituals would intensify as Vikings sought to gain favor for the coming spring and to ensure their survival through the toughest part of the year. The Yule celebration was one of the most important winter rituals. It was the Vikings' version of the winter solstice festival, a time to mark the turning of the seasons and to honor the gods. The Vikings would light massive bonfires, symbolizing the return of the sun and the triumph of light over darkness. They believed that the solstice was a time when the gods were particularly active, offering their blessings in exchange for rituals and feasts. During this time, families and communities would gather together, sharing food, telling stories, and offering sacrifices to ensure the sun's return and the warmth it would bring with it. For the Vikings, Yule wasn't just a celebration. It was a spiritual necessity. Historians still argue whether the Vikings truly saw their survival during winter as a result of divine intervention, or whether it was simply a combination of well-prepared strategies and good fortune. Some suggest that the rituals were a way for the Vikings to mentally and spiritually fortify themselves against the hardships of winter, providing them with hope and strength to face whatever came. Others believe that the Vikings' rituals were more pragmatic, connected to their deep understanding of the seasons and the cycles of nature. Either way, there's no denying that the Vikings' spirituality was woven into every part of their winter survival strategy. In addition to their rituals, Vikings also believed in spirits and magical beings that inhabited the natural world. These spirits were thought to influence everything from the weather to the health of the crops. Some of the most well-known spirits were the Landvatir, or land wights, protective spirits believed to dwell in the landscape. Vikings would often make offerings to these spirits to ensure a safe and successful winter. They believed that these spirits could help protect their homes from disaster, whether from natural forces like avalanches or from enemy raids. It was a way of integrating the spiritual and natural worlds, ensuring that all possible threats were taken into account. But the spiritual connection to winter wasn't only about protection from danger, it was also a means of embracing the season as a natural part of life. The Vikings didn't see winter as something to fear. Rather, it was a time of reflection, resilience, and renewal. As the seasons cycled through the cold, dark months, the Vikings saw it as a period of rest during which they could gather strength for the challenges ahead. It was a reminder that the world wasn't simply a series of cold, barren months. It was a cycle of death and rebirth, and that after every winter, there would always come a spring. In many ways, the Vikings' spiritual beliefs helped them endure the psychological strain of winter. Imagine living in near constant darkness, with the cold seeping into your very bones and the threat of famine always looming. How would you keep your spirits high? For the Vikings, their connection to the gods, the land, and the spirits provided a sense of purpose, strength, and guidance. The winter was not just a time of survival, it was a time of spiritual fortitude, a time to connect with the deeper forces that govern their world. The winter stretches on and the cold bites deeper. The long, dark nights in the Viking world can begin to feel never-ending. With the weather restricting movement, many Vikings relied not only on physical and spiritual strength, but also on the light they could bring into the home. The struggle against winter wasn't just a matter of keeping warm and well-fed. It was also about maintaining a sense of hope and life when everything around you seemed to be in a frozen state of stasis. One of the ways Vikings found to do this was through their methods of lighting their homes during the long hours of darkness. Vikings weren't simply content with the warmth of a fire. They knew that light was essential to maintaining both physical and mental well-being during the dark, frozen months. The central hearth, a vital source of warmth, would have also served as the main light source in the longhouse. The fire's flickering glow cast shadows across the room, providing an eerie but comforting atmosphere. Yet, the fire was often supplemented with other sources of light, primarily in the form of torches and oil lamps. The Vikings used animal fat, usually from cows or pigs, to create simple oil lamps. These lamps could be made from wood, bone, or stone, and they would burn fat or oil from animals to provide a steady source of light. The light from these lamps wasn't bright by modern standards, but it was enough to illuminate the longhouse and help guide people through the cold winter nights. Imagine being inside the warmth of your longhouse, sitting by the fire with family, the flickering of the oil lamps casting soft, dancing shadows on the walls. It wasn't just about keeping the dark at bay, it was about creating an atmosphere of safety and comfort. Historians still debate the exact ways that the Vikings lit their homes. Some argue that the oil lamps were primarily for light, while others believe they may have also served a symbolic role, guiding the souls of the dead or offering protection against spirits during the long nights. Whatever the case, the lighting inside a Viking home played an essential role in maintaining the mental health of those living through the dark winter months. Light was a lifeline, something to look forward to, even when everything outside was cold and dark. Beyond their practical use, these lights were a connection to the supernatural. Vikings believed that light represented life, warmth, and the presence of the gods. The contrast between the firelight inside and the frozen darkness outside became a symbol of their endurance. They might have also believed that keeping their homes illuminated was a way to honor the gods, making sure the gods saw their perseverance and sustained them in their struggle against the long winter. What's fascinating about Viking lighting practices is how they reflected the Vikings' mindset. These lamps and fires weren't just about function, they were about creating a sacred space within the home. The light was a barrier between the Vikings and the forces outside, the cold, the dark, and the unknown. The ritual of lighting the lamps at dusk might have been a moment of spiritual significance, as it marked the transition from day to night, from light to dark, in a world where the seasons held great power over people's lives. But there was also a very practical side to these lights. As any modern-day camper knows, trying to make your way through a long, dark night in the wilderness can feel exhausting, even if you've got the warmth of a fire. For the Vikings, who often lived in isolated, remote settlements, maintaining light in the longhouse wasn't just about comfort, it was a safety measure. The light from their fire and oil lamps allowed them to see what was going on around them, to fend off predators, and to have the necessary visibility to navigate the dark interior spaces of their homes, which were often cramped and filled with animals. Additionally, light in the form of a fire symbolized unity. The central hearth where the fire burned was often the gathering place of family, where stories were shared, food was prepared, and the day's work was reflected upon. In a world where survival was a daily struggle, having a source of light to gather around helped maintain a sense of community and connection. The longhouse was more than just a shelter. It was the heart of Viking society, and the light from the fire was what made the heart beat. While the Vikings may not have had the technology to illuminate their world like we do today, Their simple yet effective methods of lighting provided both physical warmth and spiritual strength. It wasn't just a way to get through the darkness, it was a means to fight back against the cold, the fear, and the isolation of the harsh northern winters. Now that we've talked about the central role of fire and light, it's time to consider another essential aspect of Viking life in winter: food. Keeping your stomach full was crucial during the long, cold months when supplies were scarce, and the wind made hunting and fishing difficult. But what did the Vikings eat during the darkest days of winter? Their winter diet wasn't just about survival, it was a social event as well, a way of keeping spirits high in the face of hardship. And nothing encapsulated that better than the winter feast. Feasting was an integral part of Viking culture, even in the coldest months. While they couldn't rely on fresh vegetables or fruits during the winter, the Vikings were skilled at preserving food, as we've seen earlier. This meant that during the winter, the Vikings had plenty of preserved meats, fish, grains, and dairy products to feast upon. Meat from hunting and livestock was salted, smoked, or dried to last throughout the months of snow and ice. Fish, often preserved through drying or salting, would be another major part of the Viking winter diet, especially in coastal regions. But there was more to a Viking winter feast than just practical sustenance. The Vikings saw their feasts as communal events, vital for maintaining morale and reinforcing their sense of community. Imagine sitting by the fire after a long day of work, surrounded by family and friends, enjoying a hearty meal of roasted meats, fish, and perhaps a stew made from the last of the preserved root vegetables. It wasn't just about filling your belly. It was about coming together as a group, sharing stories, and strengthening bonds during the long, dark days. The Viking feast was often a reflection of their social hierarchy as well. While the wealthier members of Viking society might enjoy more elaborate meals with more variety, perhaps a roast boar or venison, everyone would share in the enjoyment of meat, bread, and a hearty drink. You can picture the long tables filled with people, with food being passed from one person to the next, the air alive with laughter and chatter. Mead and ale would be flowing, with drinking horns raised in toasts to the gods and ancestors. It was as much a spiritual event as a social one, a chance to honor the gods who protected them during the harshest time of year. Historians still debate the nature of Viking feasts, with some suggesting that they were much more elaborate affairs than others. Some believe that Vikings may have had grand feasts to honor their gods and celebrate the winter solstice, while others argue that the feast was more about survival, about using up what they had in preparation for the coming spring. Either way, these winter feasts were a way to build and maintain community, to ensure that everyone had enough to eat, and to stave off the isolation and despair that could set in during the long months. Viking feasts didn't just serve the immediate needs of hunger, they also had a deeper, more spiritual significance. Feasts were often held in honor of the gods, and Viking leaders would offer sacrifices to ensure the safety and well-being of their people during the winter months. The Vikings were deeply connected to their gods, and their rituals often involved offerings of food, drink, and even animals to please the gods and seek their favor. This connection to the divine was especially important during the winter, when the gods were believed to be watching over the people's survival and well-being. What you ate during these feasts also carried symbolic weight. The Viking diet was closely tied to their agricultural practices and their relationship to nature. They revered the animals they hunted, farmed, and raised for their meat and milk, viewing them as gifts from the gods. To partake in the bounty of the land was to honor the gods and express gratitude for the protection and sustenance they provided. The meals themselves became an offering to the divine, ensuring that the Vikings would make it through the winter and into the spring. While the cold might have made the physical act of gathering food more difficult, it also gave the Vikings a chance to reflect on the importance of community and spirituality. The feasts they held in the winter were about more than just survival. They were about connection, honoring tradition, and showing respect for the forces that governed their world. Even though feasting and celebrations were crucial during the long winter months, there was another essential aspect of Viking survival: keeping morale high. It's easy to imagine that after weeks of snowstorms, short days, and biting winds, cabin fever might start to set in. The cold darkness would likely begin to feel oppressive, and the Vikings, no matter how strong or prepared, would experience the strain of isolation. But how did they manage to keep their spirits high through such an unforgiving season? The answer lies in the Viking winter festivals, which were designed not only to celebrate, but to reinforce the strength and unity of the community. Winter festivals were an integral part of Viking life, and these celebrations, though centered around food, drink, and ritual, also served an important psychological and social function. The most famous of these festivals was Yule, which marked the winter solstice. As we've seen earlier, the winter solstice represented a spiritual and physical turning point for the Vikings. It symbolized the return of the light after the longest night, offering hope that the worst of winter would soon pass. The solstice festival was a time of feasting, drinking, and honoring the gods in the hope of receiving blessings for the coming year. But Yule wasn't just about looking to the future. It was a time to reflect on the past year. The Vikings believed in the importance of honoring their ancestors, and during these festivals, it was common to hold rituals that connected the present to the past. Offerings were made to ancestors and spirits, acknowledging their role in the Vikings' survival and prosperity. These rituals weren't just about keeping the old traditions alive. They were about acknowledging that the cycle of life, death, and rebirth was a constant part of existence. The winter festivals allowed the Vikings to reconnect with their roots, ensuring that their identity and culture remained strong, even in the darkest days. However, not all Viking winter festivals were solemn or spiritual. There was a significant element of entertainment and enjoyment, as these gatherings were also a time to escape the monotony of the winter days. The Vikings enjoyed stories, music, and dancing, activities that helped break the long stretch of isolation. These festivals were opportunities to gather the community together, to share tales of heroism and gods, and to keep the sense of camaraderie strong. The longhouse would echo with the sounds of laughter, singing, and the clinking of drinking horns. While the winter nights were long, these social gatherings provided a much-needed respite from the cold and darkness. Historians still debate whether Viking winter festivals were as elaborate as later medieval festivals, but there's no denying that the psychological benefits of these events were profound. For the Vikings, these festivals weren't just about fun, they were about survival. During a time when the cold, the dark, and the isolation could wear down even the strongest, having a space to reconnect, share, and celebrate was essential. It allowed them to endure the worst that winter could throw at them and emerge ready for the spring. It wasn't just about the spirits of the dead or the gods. It was also about the collective strength of the community. Viking society, especially in the harsh winter months, was about mutual support. The festivals reinforced the bond between family, friends, and neighbors. They were a reminder that even in the most isolated and difficult times, the community was never truly alone. These gatherings created a sense of solidarity, allowing everyone to come together and share in the joy of surviving another winter. And let's not forget about the social aspect of these festivals. While the men were busy with their roles as warriors and hunters, women played a significant part in organizing and hosting these events. The feasts, the offerings, and the celebrations were all organized by the women, who would make sure that everyone had a place at the table. It was a chance for women to show their prowess in the kitchen and around the hearth, ensuring that no one went hungry and that the atmosphere remained joyful and spirited. The role of women in these winter festivals, much like their role in daily survival, was essential to maintaining the cohesion of Viking society. In a way, these winter festivals were the Vikings' secret weapon against the mental toll of the season. They weren't just ways to pass the time. They were deliberate, strategic events designed to bring hope, reinforce bonds, and remind everyone that, despite the dark and cold, there was still warmth, life, and community. The Viking winter festivals were a testament to the power of culture and connection, a reminder that no matter how long the night, the light would always return. At a sense of warmth, light, and community, there was also the practical side of survival that couldn't be ignored. Vikings had to be prepared to endure the physical and mental toll that winter brought with it. As the snow piled up and the world outside became increasingly inhospitable, they faced not only the hardships of limited resources and isolation, but also the toll that winter could take on their mental health. The darkness, the cold, and the long, isolated nights could wear down even the most resilient of people. But how did Vikings cope with this psychological strain? The Viking mindset was one of resilience. Vikings were raised with a sense of strength, toughness, and adaptability that allowed them to endure some of the harshest conditions imaginable. They were, after all, warriors, trained to face the harshest elements without flinching. But even warriors needed ways to handle the mental pressure that winter could bring. And it wasn't just about enduring the cold, it was about staying sharp, focused, and mentally prepared for whatever came next. A key to Viking survival through the long winter months was the sense of purpose that each person had within the community. Whether it was managing the household, training for battle, or participating in rituals, there was always something to focus on. The Viking worldview was built around the idea that every action had meaning and that contributed to the collective strength of the community. This sense of purpose helped alleviate the feelings of hopelessness that could arise during such a difficult time. Whether through work or spiritual practice, there was always a way to feel connected, engaged, and part of something larger than oneself. Historians still argue about the mental health of Vikings. Some believe that their strong spiritual and social networks helped them cope with winter's psychological challenges, while others suggest that the constant struggle for survival may have contributed to a harsh Stoic worldview, where emotional expression wasn't encouraged. Either way, Vikings were taught from a young age to endure hardship without showing weakness. And this mentality, while tough, helped them survive and even thrive in conditions that would break many people today. Another aspect of Viking mental resilience during the winter was their belief in fate. Norse mythology and the concept of word, fate, played a significant role in how the Vikings approached life and death. They believed that their lives were already partially determined by fate, and their actions would either honor or defy it. This belief allowed them to face adversity with courage, knowing that no matter how harsh the winter, they had an essential role to play in the grand scheme of things. Fate was something to be embraced, not feared. The Vikings were also accustomed to harsh conditions because of their extensive journeys. They were a seafaring people, used to long voyages across the North Atlantic, often in small ships that could easily be tossed about by storms. These experiences shaped their approach to winter. While the cold, isolation, and darkness might seem unbearable, the Vikings were used to the idea that they could conquer adversity. They had a history of resilience, whether navigating stormy seas or facing enemies in battle. This sense of invincibility was deeply ingrained in their culture, and it helped them deal with the seasonal difficulties of winter. At the same time, their spiritual beliefs provided them with a sense of comfort. The gods, after all, were believed to be deeply involved in the lives of the Vikings. Odin, Thor, Freya, and other gods were believed to watch over them, ensuring their safety and victory in battle. This belief would have been a source of comfort during the long, cold nights. In times of despair, the Vikings could turn to the gods for guidance, protection, and strength. Rituals, prayers, and offerings helped reinforce this connection and gave them the strength to endure. Yet, perhaps the most important way the Vikings coped with winter's psychological strain was through social connections. The strength of the Viking community was essential for mental survival. The longhouse was more than just a place to sleep. It was a place for socializing, sharing stories, and staying connected. Even in the most isolated communities, the Vikings would have known that they were part of a larger network of families, friends, and clans who shared in the same struggles. This sense of belonging to a larger whole provided the emotional support necessary to weather the toughest winters. In the absence of modern forms of entertainment, such as books or television, Vikings used storytelling to pass the time and keep spirits up. Tales of gods, heroes, and warriors would have filled the long, dark nights. These stories helped to preserve Viking culture and provided an outlet for creativity, as well as a way to inspire and motivate each other. Through stories, Vikings could draw strength from their ancestors and gods, reminding themselves of the power of resilience and courage. So, while it's easy to imagine that the Viking winter was an unrelenting trial of cold and deprivation, the truth is that the Vikings managed to thrive during the season because of their mental toughness, sense of community, and spiritual beliefs. Winter was a time of endurance and reflection, a time to strengthen the bonds that held society together. It was also a time to prepare, physically, mentally, and spiritually, for the challenges that lay ahead. The Vikings' ability to handle the physical and psychological strains of winter was undoubtedly aided by their strong social structure. Their community wasn't just a group of people who happened to live in the same place. It was a tightly knit society built on trust, mutual support, and shared responsibility. In fact, the social dynamics of Viking life were essential to surviving the hardships of winter. If a community member fell ill, became injured, or was too weak to contribute, the group would step in to help. This sense of solidarity was crucial when survival depended on everyone working together. One of the most important aspects of Viking social structure was the division of labor. Vikings worked together in teams to handle different aspects of daily life, whether it was preparing food, caring for livestock, or ensuring the longhouse remained in good repair. During the winter, these tasks became even more vital. You can imagine that while the men might have spent time maintaining their weapons, training, or hunting, women took on the critical roles of cooking, food preservation, spinning wool, and sewing clothes. The elderly and children also played their part in the communal effort. In the cold, dark months, everyone had a role to fill. Everyone had to pull their weight. Communities were often led by chieftains or local leaders who helped maintain order and distribute resources fairly. The role of the chieftain was particularly important during the winter, when resources were at their lowest. These leaders would ensure that everyone had access to food, warmth, and safety. They were responsible for making decisions about hunting, fishing, and rationing food during times of scarcity. At the same time, the chieftain was a spiritual leader, overseeing rituals and ceremonies to maintain the favor of the gods and protect the community from misfortune. It wasn't just the practical division of labor that made the Viking social structure work. It was also the deep sense of loyalty and honor that bound people together. Loyalty to your family, your clan, and your leader was central to Viking identity. The idea of honor was incredibly important in Viking society, particularly when it came to how they treated others in their community. This sense of honor ensured that people didn't act solely in their own self-interest. They acted in ways that benefited the group. In the context of winter, this meant that individuals were more willing to sacrifice their own comfort or time to help a neighbor or a family member who was struggling. The shared goal of survival created a bond that couldn't easily be broken. The Vikings' ability to rely on each other was especially important during the darkest months of the year when food was limited, supplies were running low, and the days seemed to stretch on forever. The solidarity between the members of a Viking community helped buffer the psychological effects of isolation and despair. It was also a way for them to maintain their sense of purpose. In these tight-knit groups, everyone had something to contribute, whether it was physical labor or emotional support. Even when the world outside was unforgiving, the community itself could offer warmth and hope. Interestingly, the Vikings had a particular ritual that reinforced these communal bonds. The Thing. The Thing was an assembly or gathering where Vikings came together to make decisions, settle disputes, and discuss issues affecting the community. These gatherings were a place where everyone had a voice, regardless of social status. The Thing could take place at any time of year, but it was particularly important in the winter when decisions about resource distribution, hunting strategies, and clan alliances were made. These gatherings helped reinforce the communal spirit, ensuring that the needs of the community were met and that the bonds between its members remained strong. Of course, this communal structure wasn't without its challenges. The Vikings, like any society, had internal conflicts, especially when resources were scarce or when the threat of external enemies loomed large. Winter, however, was a time when these conflicts were often put aside in favor of mutual survival. The harshness of the season required a level of cooperation and compromise that was vital to everyone's survival. The ability to resolve disputes and work together was just as important as food preservation, physical strength, or spiritual rituals. Still, there were moments of tension, especially when food supplies were low, and people had to ration their portions. This was a time when loyalty to the group truly showed its value. When the longhouse was filled with the smell of salt-cured meats, the sound of crackling fires, and the laughter of feasts, the Viking community became more than just a group of individuals struggling to survive. It became a family bound by a shared history, a shared struggle, and a shared hope for the future. It's no wonder that, even in the most difficult of winters, the Vikings could emerge stronger. Their culture, built on deep social bonds, a strong sense of honor, and an unshakable connection to the divine, gave them the strength to weather the coldest, most unforgiving times. In the darkness of winter, the Vikings turned to each other for support, and together they became unstoppable. Winter begins to recede. The Vikings, along with the rest of nature, are starting to stir once again. The ground, frozen solid for months, begins to thaw, and the harsh winds lose their bite. Yet, even as the season shifts, the lessons learned from the long winter months are far from forgotten. The Vikings were keenly aware that survival wasn't just about managing the present moment. It was about preparing for the future, adapting, and understanding that the cycle of seasons was constant. The Vikings had a deep connection to the land, and their ability to adapt to changing conditions ensured that they not only survived, but flourished when the thaw came. For the Vikings, spring wasn't just the return of warmth, it was the beginning of a new cycle of growth. After enduring months of cold and darkness, it must have felt like a resurrection, a promise that life would return, and the battles of survival would give way to new endeavors. But it wasn't just about sowing seeds in the soil. It was about sowing the seeds for the year ahead. The lessons from winter would influence every aspect of Viking life in the coming year. In preparation for the warmer months, the Vikings would begin to gather and repair tools, weapons, and structures. The longhouse, where the family had spent the darkest months, needed to be cleared and aired out. Any remaining food supplies would be carefully cataloged, and new plans for the coming harvests would be made. The Vikings were not the kind of people to wait idly for the changing seasons. They used the time at the beginning of spring to actively plan and prepare for what was to come. The knowledge they gained from surviving the winter informed every decision they made, from food production to their approach to warfare. Spring was also the time when the Vikings' ability to navigate, trade, and raid would come into full swing. The ice and snow that had frozen their rivers and shores would melt, opening up new trade routes and raiding opportunities. The sea, which had been impassable for so long, would once again be navigable. Viking warriors, having spent the winter in training and reflection, would be ready to set sail once more. Their longships, which had been stored and maintained during the cold months, were now prepped and ready to carry the Vikings across the waters in search of new lands and riches. The cycle of warfare, trade, and exploration would begin anew. However, the transition from winter to spring also brought a different kind of challenge. The change of seasons, while welcome, brought with it a sense of urgency. The Vikings needed to ensure that they were ready to meet the demands of the upcoming months, and that meant more work. Spring was the time to plant crops, tend to animals, and prepare for the harvest that would sustain them through the next winter. The Vikings, deeply tied to their agricultural practices, knew that the work of spring required every ounce of energy and focus. As they moved from the stillness of winter to the hustle of spring, the Vikings also took time to honor the gods once again. Spring rituals would be held to ensure a bountiful harvest and to thank the gods for their protection during the difficult winter months. These ceremonies, often filled with sacrifices and offerings, were crucial to the Vikings' spiritual well-being. The gods, who had watched over them in the darkness, were thanked and honored as the Vikings looked forward to the challenges and rewards of the new season. One fascinating element of Viking life was their ability to turn what could have been seen as a grim, harsh time of year into an opportunity for growth. Winter was never merely a season of survival. It was a season of preparation. Every challenge that came with the winter was met head on, and in the end, the Vikings emerged from it with stronger bonds, deeper resilience, and a sense of accomplishment. They did not just endure the winter, they made it a part of their cycle of growth, strength, and continuity. Historians still argue over whether Viking society was primarily driven by survival instincts or whether they had a more philosophical approach to the seasons. Some believe that the Vikings viewed winter as an inevitable but temporary trial that had to be endured for the greater good. Others argue that winter was more than just a physical challenge. It was a spiritual one that required deep mental and emotional strength to overcome. Whatever the interpretation, one thing is clear. The Viking approach to the winter months was a holistic one, involving every aspect of their lives, body, mind, and spirit. So, as the last of the snow melts and the first signs of life begin to return to the world, the Vikings move forward, refreshed and renewed, ready to face whatever challenges the coming months bring. The cycle of life continues, just as it always has, with winter giving way to spring and spring preparing them for the seasons ahead. With each passing year, the Vikings, ever resilient, would face the coming cold once again, knowing that their endurance and adaptability would carry them through. Now that the long, hard winter has passed and the fresh green of spring begins to reappear, the Viking people look ahead, knowing that the lessons learned from surviving the cold will help them face the challenges of the year to come. In their world, survival was never guaranteed, and so the Vikings were always looking for ways to build on their successes, learn from their failures, and prepare for the future. Their adaptability and resourcefulness ensured that, no matter how brutal the winter, they would always find a way through. After surviving the long months of harsh conditions, the Vikings were incredibly aware of the importance of resource management. The winter months tested their preparedness, but spring allowed them to refocus their efforts on more sustainable strategies. The first order of business was always making sure that food supplies were replenished. The Vikings relied heavily on agriculture to ensure they had enough to eat during the months when fresh food was scarce. With the thawing of the land, it was time to plant crops: barley, oats, rye, and other grains that would provide the bulk of their nutrition in the months ahead. Planting crops wasn't just about food, though. It was about security. The Vikings knew that to thrive in their cold and sometimes unpredictable world, they needed to ensure a steady food supply. Crop cultivation also signaled the start of trade, as grain and other agricultural products could be traded with neighboring communities, helping them acquire the goods they didn't produce themselves. Trading was vital to the Vikings' economy, and it was in spring when they began to make the most of the melting rivers and open sea routes to carry their goods to market. But planting crops and managing food supplies wasn't all that the Vikings did during the warmer months. They also worked on repairing the tools, weapons, and equipment necessary for their future success. The long winter had been a time to tend to their homes and stay warm, but now that the cold was gone, it was time to sharpen axes, swords, and shields, readying themselves for whatever lay ahead. Whether they planned to go on raids, defend their lands, or simply protect their communities, having well-maintained weapons was critical. After months of downtime, this spring cleaning was vital in preparing for the challenges of the coming year. As the Vikings prepared for both war and peace, the role of the women in their communities remained just as vital. In the spring, while the men went to work in the fields, tended to the animals, or prepared for the upcoming raids, women were often the backbone of the household, ensuring that the family had everything it needed to thrive. Women continued the essential work of preserving food, managing domestic affairs, and, in many cases, running the household in the absence of their husbands, who might be away on expeditions. They maintained the intricate systems of social organization that allowed Viking communities to function smoothly, managing both the domestic and economic side of life. But with the return of warmer weather, the Viking sense of adventure and expansion was never far behind. While spring brought renewal and growth, it also sparked the Viking desire for exploration, trade, and raids. The end of the harsh winter meant the beginning of sea voyages. Viking longships, stored away during the cold months, were now ready to carry their warriors across seas and rivers in search of new lands, riches, and trade routes. The longships, expertly designed to glide through both the open sea and narrow rivers, made the Vikings the most formidable naval power of their time. In spring, Viking warriors would assemble for raids, prepared to strike with the ferocity that had been sharpened during the cold winter months of training. They didn't just survive the winter, they had spent it honing their skills, ensuring that they were prepared for anything. And while warfare was a central part of Viking life, so too was trade, which helped fuel their economy and culture. The Vikings established trade routes stretching from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, and their seafaring prowess ensured that they could travel and trade with cultures across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. But even though the Vikings were known for their fierce raids and conquests, it wasn't all about war. The transition into spring also meant the opportunity for diplomatic engagement. Viking chieftains often forged alliances with neighboring tribes, settled disputes, and brokered peace, ensuring that their communities would prosper through the summer months. Spring, for the Vikings, wasn't just about fighting or trading. It was a time for new beginnings, both in terms of harvest and diplomacy. And while the Vikings would once again venture out to explore new lands, the return of spring also signaled a shift in their domestic lives. The challenges of winter, while brutal, had brought communities closer together. The spring provided a chance for reflection on how to continue those bonds into the rest of the year. For the Vikings, their survival in the face of such harsh conditions wasn't just a matter of luck or brute strength. It was about community, resourcefulness, and preparation. As the days grow warmer, the cycle of life continues for the Vikings. The survival lessons of winter shape everything they do. From managing food supplies to repairing tools and weapons to exploring new opportunities through trade and conquest, the Vikings are constantly adapting, always moving forward. The transition from the cold, isolated winter months to the vibrant, bustling spring is a reminder that survival isn't just about facing challenges. It's about building resilience, adapting, and looking to the future. The Vikings brace for the coming challenges and opportunities that spring brings. There's one more aspect of their life that stands out in how it impacted their survival: their ability to navigate the wilderness and survive in the harshest environments. The Viking world was not just about the comforts of the longhouse or the thrill of a raid. It was also about the wilderness, the forests, mountains, and rivers that formed the backdrop to every aspect of their lives. Winter may have kept them indoors, but as the thaw began, the Vikings had to venture back out into the wild, where survival often meant knowing how to read the landscape and use it to their advantage. Navigating the wilderness during the spring thaw was no small feat. After months of snow and ice, the landscape shifted rapidly. Rivers swollen with meltwater could flood, turning once navigable paths into dangerous obstacles. The forest, still bearing the scars of winter's chill, would need to be carefully navigated. Yet the Vikings knew their land like no other people. They had a deep, almost intuitive understanding of the environment around them. Their survival depended on their ability to read the weather, the terrain, and the signs of nature, allowing them to move safely and efficiently through what could otherwise be a treacherous wilderness. The Vikings were skilled trackers and hunters, and these skills would have been put to the test during the spring months, as they had to hunt for food, gather resources, and prepare for the growing season. Hunting during the thaw was tricky because the ice had melted and the snow had disappeared, which meant that the animals that they would hunt were harder to track. But the Vikings knew the land well and could rely on subtle signs: the broken branches of trees, the tracks left by animals in the softening earth, or the sound of movement in the underbrush. These signs guided them through the dense forests and across open plains, ensuring that they could find food, especially as they began to run low on their preserved stores from the winter. Fishing also took on a different role in the spring. While ice fishing had been the primary method of obtaining fish during the colder months, the thaw brought opportunities for fishing in rivers, lakes, and even coastal waters. As the rivers began to swell with runoff, the fish would travel upstream, and the Vikings knew that this was the best time to cast their nets and catch fish. The melting ice would also cause shifts in the availability of certain fish, as some species would move to different areas or depths. Vikings used their keen understanding of the environment to know exactly when and where to fish, often ensuring a steady supply of food just when they needed it most. One key aspect of Viking survival in the wilderness was their ability to navigate the waters of the seas and rivers. While the longships may have been primarily used for raiding and travel across the seas, they were also invaluable for navigating inland waterways, especially during the spring months. The Vikings used their longships to travel along rivers, across lakes, and through fjords, reaching places that other people could not. The shallow draft design of the longships allowed them to venture into narrow rivers and streams, while their sails made it easy to catch the spring winds to help them travel long distances. The longship was not only a tool for conquest, but a vital lifeline for trade and exploration, connecting the Vikings to other cultures and ensuring their survival even in distant lands. The Vikings' relationship with the wilderness wasn't simply a matter of survival, it was also spiritual. They believed that the land, the rivers, and the seas were not just physical places, but realms inhabited by spirits, gods, and magical beings. The Vikings made offerings to the Landvatir, the spirits of the land, to ensure their protection as they ventured into the wild. These spirits were believed to guard the forests, mountains, and waterways, and it was considered crucial to show respect for them when moving through their territories. The Vikings' rituals and beliefs were deeply tied to the landscape, and they saw their connection to nature as something that went beyond mere survival. There's still some debate among scholars about how closely the Vikings' spirituality and survival tactics were intertwined. Some believe that their belief in spirits and gods was simply a way to explain the unknown and cope with the dangers of the wilderness. Others argue that the spiritual and practical elements of Viking life were inseparable, with the Vikings actively seeking the protection of the gods and spirits in all their endeavors, from hunting to warfare to everyday survival. What is certain, though, is that the Vikings saw their relationship with the wilderness as one that required both respect and knowledge, and that this deep connection to the natural world played a major role in their ability to thrive in such a harsh environment. The idea that Vikings could endure not only the physical challenges of winter, but also the mental and emotional toll of navigating a world that was constantly shifting and changing, is a testament to their resilience. The wilderness wasn't just something they survived, it was something they mastered. And as the spring thaw brought new challenges and opportunities, the Vikings stood ready, equipped with the knowledge, skills, and spiritual strength to face whatever came next. And the days grow longer, the Vikings face a new set of challenges, not only in their personal survival, but in how they defend and protect their homes. The harsh winter has tested their resilience, but now that the world is thawing, the focus shifts to preparing for the potential threats that come with a new season. Spring isn't just about new growth and fresh opportunities. It's also a time to reinforce defenses and ensure the safety of the community from external dangers, including raids from rival groups or the harsh conditions that could still strike unexpectedly. One of the first priorities of Viking leadership as the weather turns was the security of their settlements. Though the Vikings were known for their ability to raid and fight, they also understood the importance of fortifying their homes during spring. With trade and communication routes reopening, the Vikings often faced a greater risk of external threats, whether from rival clans or raiders who sought to take advantage of the thawing terrain. Viking villages were typically built near rivers or coastal areas, and these places were both strategic for trade and vulnerable to attack. Viking defenses were centered around the borg, or fortifications that protected the settlement. These structures were often made from wood, but some, especially in more developed regions, included earthworks or stone walls. The construction of these defenses was not simply about walls or gates, it was about preparing for any possible siege. The Viking warriors were trained to defend these structures, and while the focus during winter was on survival, Spring brought a focus on reinforcing fortifications. These walls and gates would be patrolled, and sentries would be stationed to ensure that no surprise attacks could catch the community off guard. Another element of Viking warfare was their thing, the communal assemblies, where Vikings gathered to discuss important issues and make collective decisions. The thing wasn't just a gathering for legal matters or local disputes. It was also a place where warriors were mustered, strategies were discussed, and plans were made for any potential raids or defense needs. In spring, as the community came out of the darkness of winter, these gatherings became more frequent, with chieftains or clan leaders addressing the need for preparation and unity. It was here that the Vikings would solidify their plans for any campaigns, ensuring that everyone knew their role, from the youngest warriors to the oldest leaders. These meetings were a crucial component of Viking social and military structure. One might think of the Viking raids as being primarily a summer activity, given that it was easier to navigate the seas and rivers in warmer months. But spring was a key period of preparation, as it marked the start of planning for expeditions. It wasn't just about sharpening weapons or maintaining ships. It was also about gathering the necessary resources for an effective raid. Viking raiders would stockpile food and water, readying their ships for long journeys. These expeditions were organized with precision, ensuring that warriors, supplies, and vessels were ready for anything. The longer the Vikings waited, the more strategic their plans became, particularly when facing formidable opponents. The Viking longship, the iconic vessel that was so crucial to their raiding success, required special attention during this time. After months of sitting idle during the winter, these ships were carefully inspected and repaired, with their hulls cleaned and their sails prepared. The longship's design made it a perfect vessel for both warfare and trade, and as the thaw set in, the Vikings turned their attention to getting these ships back in shape for the season. Their shallow draft allowed the ships to navigate rivers, lakes, and coastal waters with ease, making them a highly effective tool in both battle and exploration. By spring, these vessels were ready to carry the Vikings across the waters once more, whether for trade, conquest, or further exploration. But Viking defense wasn't just about preparing for raids from others. It was also about ensuring that the community could defend itself from the harsh realities of nature. The Vikings, being close to nature, understood that the unpredictable weather and the ever-changing terrain were just as dangerous as human enemies. Flooding from snowmelt, sudden storms, and other natural disasters could wreak havoc on their homes, farms, and livestock. In the spring, they would prepare for these potential threats by reinforcing homes, securing livestock pens, and ensuring that critical food stores were safe from the elements. Their survival depended on how well they could adapt to both man-made and natural dangers. While the Vikings were masters of warfare, they also valued the arts of diplomacy and negotiation. Spring brought opportunities for trade with neighboring communities, which required the Vikings to maintain positive relations with their allies and rivals alike. Negotiating with other groups for access to resources, land, or trade routes was vital. The Vikings were skilled traders, and many of their raids were not only about conquest, but also about securing valuable resources, such as metals, spices, and silks, that could be traded or used in their own crafts. Thus, spring became a time to renew diplomatic efforts, make alliances, and strengthen trade relationships, ensuring that they had access to the supplies they needed for the year ahead. With the melting of the snow and the opening of the seas, spring also brought a sense of renewal. It was a time to look ahead to what the future would hold: new raids, new alliances, and new opportunities for growth and exploration. But despite this forward-thinking mindset, the Vikings never lost sight of the lessons they had learned during the long, difficult winter months. They knew that survival required constant vigilance, preparation, and adaptation. They had faced the brutal cold and the isolation of winter, and now, with the arrival of spring, they were more than ready to face whatever the new season had in store. As spring sweeps across the land, and the ice and snow give way to green shoots and blossoming flowers, the Vikings, with their characteristic resilience, step into the new season prepared for both the challenges and opportunities it brings. With winter's grip loosened, life in the Viking world begins to accelerate, and while the thaw brings a sense of renewal and growth, it also brings a fresh round of hard work. The Vikings were never the type to wait passively for a change in the seasons. They took it upon themselves to shape their future with the same resourcefulness and determination they used to survive the hardest of winters. Agriculture was one of the primary focuses as the Vikings moved into spring. The thaw was a signal that it was time to get to work on the fields, cultivating the crops that would sustain the community throughout the year. Barley, rye, and oats were some of the most commonly grown grains, providing the bulk of their food. These crops not only sustained the Vikings, but were also vital for brewing ale, an integral part of Viking social life. The Vikings' relationship with the land was profound, and every piece of fertile soil was seen as a resource to be carefully tended and respected. What is fascinating is that despite their reputation as seafaring raiders and warriors, the Vikings were also skilled farmers and understood the land cycles deeply. They planted and harvested according to the natural rhythms, and their farming techniques were efficient, ensuring that every season's harvest was used to its fullest potential. Women, as always, played a crucial role in this process. While the men might have been busy preparing weapons, organizing raids, or negotiating with neighboring communities, the women were key to managing food production and storage. Women worked in the fields, planting and harvesting crops, and took responsibility for preserving the food through drying, salting, and fermenting, ensuring that the community was supplied year-round. Spring, however, wasn't just about growing food. It was also about gathering what nature had to offer. The Vikings were hunters and gatherers as much as they were farmers, and the thaw brought opportunities for both. The wilds of Scandinavia teemed with animals during this time, and the Vikings would once again go hunting, tracking deer, elk, and other game through the newly softened earth. It was a time to replenish their stores of meat, while also securing new hides, antlers, and furs that would be valuable for clothing or trade. The hunting season was brief but vital for survival, and the Vikings' experience and knowledge of the land ensured they didn't miss their window. Fishing, too, took on a more prominent role during this time. The rivers, lakes, and seas became more accessible as the ice melted, and fish that had been swimming in deeper waters during the cold months were now closer to the surface, making them easier to catch. The Vikings would use their boats, nets, and even traps to gather fish, ensuring that their community had a steady supply of protein. The seasonal shift allowed them to rely less on dried and salted fish and more on fresh catches, providing variety in their diet. Fishing also played an important role in trade, as the Vikings had extensive coastal and river-based trade routes, often bartering fish for other goods, such as timber, metals, and even slaves. With the natural world coming back to life, the Vikings also returned to their boats and ships. The longships, which had been stored and protected during the winter months, were now brought back to life. These ships were the pride of Viking society, symbolizing their connection to the sea and their reputation as formidable warriors and traders. In the spring, the Vikings would carefully inspect and repair their vessels, ensuring that they were seaworthy and ready for long journeys. The craftsmanship of the longship was unparalleled, with sleek, flexible hulls designed for speed, maneuverability, and durability. The Vikings could sail these ships across vast expanses of ocean or navigate narrow rivers with equal ease, and as the ice broke away, they were once again ready to set sail. Beyond the immediate concerns of agriculture, hunting, and fishing, spring also brought a renewed sense of adventure and exploration. The Vikings were a restless people, driven by the need to discover, conquer, and trade. With the seas finally open, it wasn't just about surviving in Scandinavia. It was about looking outward, toward new opportunities. Viking warriors, having spent the winter training and preparing for raids, were eager to set sail for foreign shores. Their knowledge of the sea, honed through years of seafaring, would carry them far. Spring signaled the start of the Viking campaign season, and the prospect of raiding or trading would pull the Vikings into foreign lands in search of wealth, resources, and new conquests. But exploration wasn't just about war, it was about trade and expansion. The Vikings were incredible traders, establishing trade routes stretching from the British Isles and Western Europe to the Middle East and even parts of Asia. They exchanged furs, timber, and amber for silver, spices, textiles, and other luxury goods. Spring's thaw meant that trade routes could be reopened, ships could be loaded, and goods could flow freely once again. Whether traveling by river or sea, the Vikings used their longships to reach markets far and wide, taking advantage of the thaw to engage in commerce and diplomacy, making the most of the opportunities the season brought. As the Vikings engaged in their agricultural, military, and commercial activities, they were always aware that the coming winter would require just as much preparation. The lessons learned from surviving a harsh winter were never far from their minds, even as they enjoyed the wealth and opportunity that spring brought. Every raid, every trade, every crop planted was done with an eye toward the future. The Vikings knew that to thrive, they needed to continually adapt, prepare, and act with the cycles of nature in mind. In the end, the Viking way of life was one of constant movement, both physically and spiritually. The harsh winter months, filled with darkness and struggle, were followed by a vibrant spring of growth and opportunity, but the Vikings' connection to the land, the sea, and the natural world kept them grounded. They thrived not because they were immune to hardship, but because they faced it head-on, adapting to every challenge with resourcefulness, courage, and the unshakable belief that survival depended on their ability to move forward, no matter the season. As the Vikings stand on the brink of another year, their understanding of survival has come full circle. The long, cold winter and the fleeting warmth of spring have shaped their lives in ways that transcend mere endurance. They've created a way of living that has allowed them not only to survive but to thrive in the harshest of conditions. Every season brings its own set of challenges, yet each challenge is met with the same relentless spirit, adaptability, and resourcefulness that have become synonymous with Viking culture. Looking back at the long winter months, it's clear that the Vikings' approach to survival wasn't a passive one. It wasn't just about enduring the cold. It was about making active choices to navigate and thrive despite the harshness of nature. They were meticulous in their preparations, stockpiling food, maintaining their shelters, and ensuring they had the tools necessary for survival. They understood that survival wasn't guaranteed, so every aspect of their life, from their clothing to their homes to their mindset, had to be meticulously crafted to keep them safe. But the story of Viking survival doesn't end with the arrival of spring. In fact, the arrival of spring is not just a time of renewal, but also a time of reflection. The Vikings were acutely aware of the cyclical nature of life. The harsh winter was inevitable, just as the vibrant spring would follow. The key to their survival was not only adapting to the present moment, but also anticipating what would come next, always preparing for the challenges ahead while honoring the wisdom of the past. For the Vikings, survival was a continuous, dynamic process. It wasn't about settling into one mode of existence and hoping for the best. Instead, they were always active participants in their own survival, constantly evaluating and refining their methods. From the preparations made during the winter months to the strategic plans set in motion in spring, the Vikings moved with the seasons, always thinking several steps ahead, always ready to face whatever challenges lay in store. This approach to life was deeply embedded in Viking culture. The idea that life is a cycle, full of both challenges and opportunities, was reflected in every part of their lives. Their mythologies, rituals, and beliefs spoke to the idea of balance between light and dark, life and death, warmth and cold. The survival skills that the Vikings perfected weren't just practical, they were spiritual as well. They saw survival as an act of honoring the gods and the forces of nature that governed their world. It was a way of aligning themselves with the cycles of the universe, ensuring their place in it. Winter was, in many ways, the Vikings' test. It forced them to draw on every ounce of their strength, ingenuity, and cooperation. But once they had weathered the storm, so to speak, the arrival of spring signified not just the renewal of the world around them, but the renewal of their own determination. After the solitude and hardship of winter, the Vikings returned to the world with a newfound energy, ready to face the world once again. Even as spring begins, there is still a subtle reminder of the lessons learned during winter. The Vikings' awareness of the fragility of life, the fleeting nature of warmth, and the ever-present possibility of adversity make them keenly aware of the importance of resilience. It's a resilience that isn't simply about surviving, but about thriving, growing, and expanding. Whether through warfare, trade, or agriculture, the Vikings were a people of action, always striving to ensure their future, always prepared to adapt to whatever came next. The Viking way of life was cyclical: survival, adaptation, renewal, and then the challenge of facing what lay ahead. With each cycle, they didn't just wait for the seasons to change, they actively shaped their destiny. They knew that each season brought new opportunities and challenges, and they were ready for both. The winter was harsh, yes, but it was followed by the warmth of spring, a time for new beginnings, fresh starts, and the ongoing pursuit of growth. The Vikings were in tune with the natural world, living in harmony with it, yet also challenging it in ways that allowed them to thrive. So, as spring arrives, filled with the potential of a new year, the Vikings take it all in stride. They don't just rest on their laurels or revel in their success. Instead, they understand that the cycle continues. Just as they survived the darkness of winter, they now turn to embrace the brightness of spring, ready for whatever comes next, knowing that each challenge met makes them stronger, more resilient, and more prepared for the future. The Vikings teach us that survival is not just about enduring. It's about learning, adapting, and using every season of life to grow. Whether it's the coldest winter or the warmest spring, the Viking spirit lives on in the way they face the world. With unwavering determination, a deep connection to their land, and an unshakable belief in their ability to conquer whatever lay ahead. As the Vikings continue to thrive in their ever-changing world, the lessons learned from surviving the harsh winters become deeply ingrained in their culture, forming the foundation of everything they do. The resilience they develop during those cold, isolated months stays with them, shaping their identities and guiding their actions. It's not just about surviving the challenges life throws at you, it's about learning from them, adapting, and coming out stronger on the other side. And as we reach the final chapter of our journey through the Viking winters, we begin to understand the ultimate lesson they impart: that survival is a blend of strength, community, and adaptability. The Vikings' ability to face winter's trials is a reflection of their overall approach to life. Whether it was their fierce warrior spirit, their intricate social structures, or their deep connection to the natural world, everything in Viking society was built around survival. But not just mere survival. They survived to live with purpose, to thrive and to grow, even when the world around them seemed determined to make survival impossible. But as the years passed and the seasons continued their cyclical journey, the Viking way of life evolved. The harsh winters, while ever present, became more than just a battle to endure. They were a proving ground. The Vikings did not simply cope with their environment. They mastered it. They understood that survival was not a solitary pursuit, but a communal effort. Each individual contributed to the whole, and the strength of the group ensured the survival of all. Their reliance on one another, their ability to trust in their community, and their shared understanding of the land made them not just survivors, but conquerors of their environment. There's a lesson here for all of us, whether we live in the icy wilderness of Scandinavia or the warmth of a modern city. The Vikings remind us that survival is not just about physical endurance. It's about mental resilience, the ability to adapt to changing circumstances, and the willingness to face life's hardships with both courage and humility. They didn't just survive the dark days of winter. They used them to reflect, to prepare, and to emerge stronger, wiser, and more united. It's also worth remembering that the Vikings didn't face their trials alone. Whether through winter feasts, social gatherings, or shared work, they found ways to connect with one another, to lift each other up, and to share the burden of survival. The strength of the community is one of the most enduring aspects of Viking life. They knew that their survival was intertwined with the survival of those around them, and together they could weather any storm, both literal and figurative. As the final snow melts and the first buds of spring appear, we too are reminded of the resilience that lies within us. Like the Vikings, we face our own winters, times of hardship, uncertainty, and challenge. But it is in those moments that we are called to dig deep, to find strength in ourselves and in those around us. The Vikings didn't just survive, they thrived in the face of adversity, and so can we. We too can find ways to adapt, to face our challenges head on, and to learn and grow from every experience. So as we look back on this journey through the Viking winter, we see that their story is not one of simple survival. It is one of perseverance, courage, and unshakable resolve. It's a story that reminds us that no matter how harsh the winters of life may seem, they are followed by spring, a time of renewal, growth, and endless possibilities. Now, as the final moments of this journey slip into the quiet of the night, take a moment to reflect on the strength of the Viking spirit. Through every challenge, they faced the cold with bravery, they weathered the darkness with hope, and they turned every struggle into an opportunity for growth. And just like them, we too can rise to meet whatever challenges lie ahead, knowing that, like the Vikings, we have the strength to survive and the wisdom to thrive.